Move to the back where you belong." The words sliced through the first-class cabin of Apex Airlines Flight 847 like a blade through silk. At 11:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 30,000 feet above the ground seemed like the last place on Earth for a confrontation about human dignity, but Jennifer Walsh had other plans. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had never been told no, never been questioned, never been anything other than the center of attention in every room she entered. She stood in the aisle wearing a cream-colored Chanel blazer that probably cost more than most people made in a month, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at the woman seated quietly in 1A. That woman was Alexis Rivera, though nobody on that plane knew it yet. At 42, she had the kind of quiet confidence that came from building something extraordinary from nothing. She sat in the window seat wearing designer athleisure that looked casual, but cost a fortune. Her dark curls pulled back in a simple ponytail, her attention focused on a tablet displaying complex engineering schematics that would have made NASA engineers weep with envy. But to Jennifer Walsh, she was just another problem to be solved, another obstacle to be moved, another person who clearly didn't understand her place in the world. Before we dive deeper into this story that's about to turn the aviation industry upside down, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. And if this opening already has your blood boiling, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is going to restore your faith in justice. The morning had started like any other for Alexis Rivera. She had arrived at JFK Airport 2 hours early, not because she needed to, but because she preferred the quiet moments before a flight. Her company, Rivera Aerospace Technologies, had contracts worth billions of dollars, and she was flying to Los Angeles to close the biggest deal of her career, a $500 million military navigation contract that would revolutionize how aircraft operated in combat zones. She carried herself with the easy grace of someone who owned every room she entered, though she preferred to let others discover that fact gradually. Her briefcase contained patents worth more than the GDP of small countries, and her smartphone held direct numbers to Pentagon officials, Fortune 500 CEOs, and heads of state. But none of that mattered to Jennifer Walsh. All Jennifer saw was a black woman in what she considered her space, and that was unacceptable. "Excuse me," Jennifer continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure every passenger in first class could hear her. "There's obviously been some kind of mistake here." Alexis looked up from her tablet, her brown eyes calm but alert. She had seen this expression before, that particular combination of confusion and indignation that crossed certain faces when they encountered her in spaces they believed she didn't belong. It was the same look she'd gotten at 14 when she won the state science fair. The same look she'd received at 18 when she graduated valedictorian from MIT. The same look that had followed her through every boardroom, every conference room, every first-class cabin for the past 2 decades. "I don't believe there's been any mistake," Alexis replied, her voice steady and professional. She didn't move from her seat, didn't reach for her boarding pass, didn't feel the need to justify her presence. "I'm in seat 1A. This is where I'm supposed to be." Jennifer's husband, Robert Walsh, a man whose success in commercial real estate had inflated his sense of importance far beyond his actual achievements, stepped up beside his wife. He was the kind of man who wore his wealth like armor, with a Rolex that caught the cabin lights and a suit that cost more than most people's cars. His presence was meant to intimidate, and it usually worked. "Look," Lady Robert said, his voice carrying the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never faced real consequences for his words. "My wife booked this seat months ago. Obviously, there's been some kind of mix-up with your ticket. But it was Taylor Johnson in seat 3C who understood what was really happening. At 29, Taylor had built a career as a social media influencer by recognizing moments that mattered, and every instinct was screaming that this was one of them." Taylor discreetly pulled out a phone and opened the live stream app. Within seconds, viewers were tuning in to what looked like a routine flight delay but felt like something much more significant. "Something's happening on my flight," Taylor whispered to the camera. "First-class drama. This could get interesting." Carlos Martinez, the flight attendant assigned to the first-class cabin, approached with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was walking into a situation that could define his career. At 26, he was new enough to the job to still care about doing the right thing, but experienced enough to recognize when passengers were about to make his life complicated. "Is there a problem here?" Carlos asked, his Hispanic accent carrying just the faintest tremor of uncertainty. Jennifer turned to him with the full force of her indignation. "Yes, there absolutely is a problem. This woman is in our seat, and we need it resolved immediately." "Ma'am," Carlos replied, checking his passenger manifest on a small tablet, "this passenger is assigned to 1A. Her ticket is valid, and she's in the correct seat." "That's impossible," Jennifer snapped. "People like her don't fly first class on routes like this." "Check again." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. People like her. 4 words that said everything and nothing, that carried centuries of assumption and prejudice, wrapped in the thin veneer of plausible deniability. Alexis felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger exactly, but a crystallization of purpose. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. She had built her company partly as a response to rooms like this, to moments like this, to people who looked at her and saw everything except what she actually was. "People like me," Alexis asked, her voice still calm, but carrying a note of steel that made Carlos step back slightly. Jennifer's face flushed with the uncomfortable realization that she had said something she probably shouldn't have said out loud, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "You know what I mean. This is first class. It's expensive. I'm just saying that mistakes happen." But Alexis Rivera didn't make mistakes about where she belonged. She had earned every seat she had ever occupied, every room she had ever entered, every space she had ever claimed as her own, and she was about to prove it in a way that would change everything. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. But before this confrontation could escalate further, it's important to understand exactly who these people were and how they had all ended up in the same enclosed space 35,000 feet above the ground. Alexis Rivera had been building toward this moment her entire life, though she didn't know it yet. Born to a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to pay for engineering textbooks during the day. Alexis had learned early that success wasn't just about being smart. It was about being smart enough to survive in rooms where people assumed you didn't belong. The flashback came to her unbidden as she sat in that airplane seat listening to Jennifer Walsh question her right to exist in that space. She was 12 years old again, sitting in Mr. Peterson's 7th grade math class, the only black girl in advanced placement. She had just solved a calculus problem that the teacher hadn't expected any of his students to understand, and instead of praise, she received suspicion. "Alexis," Mr. Peterson had said, his voice carrying that same tone Jennifer Walsh was using. "Now, did someone help you with this? Maybe an older sibling or a parent?" The assumption was clear. A girl who looked like her couldn't possibly have solved that problem on her own. She must have cheated. Must have gotten help, must have somehow gamed the operation to appear more capable than she actually was. That moment had planted a seed in 12-year-old Alexis Rivera that would grow into a forest of determination. Now, 30 years later, she owned patents on the navigation equipment that kept commercial aircraft safely in the sky. Her company employed 15,000 people across 12 countries. Her technology was installed in 70% of the aircraft currently in service worldwide. But to Jennifer Walsh, she was still just a girl who didn't belong in advanced placement. Jennifer Walsh, on the other hand, had never questioned her right to occupy any space she entered. Born into old Connecticut money, she had attended the right schools, married the right man, joined the right clubs, and spent 48 years assuming the world would continue to arrange itself around her convenience. Her husband Robert's commercial real estate empire had multiplied their wealth into the hundreds of millions, and Jennifer had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by speaking to the right manager, dropping the right name, or writing the right check. She wore her privilege like perfume, invisible to herself but overwhelming to everyone around her. The cream-colored Chanel blazer, the Hermes handbag, the shoes that cost more than most people's rent. These weren't just clothing items to Jennifer. They were statements of identity, declarations of worth weapons in a war she didn't even realize she was fighting. Robert Walsh stood behind his wife with the uncomfortable posture of a man who had spent 25 years of marriage learning when to support his wife's battles and when to disappear into the background. He had built his fortune by being shrewd, calculating, and ruthlessly practical, but Jennifer's social confrontations made him nervous. Still, loyalty was loyalty, and if his wife said there was a problem with their seating arrangement, then there was a problem with their seating arrangement. Carlos Martinez had been working for Apex Airlines for 18 months, long enough to recognize the warning signs of a passenger complaint that could escalate beyond his pay grade, but not long enough to handle it with the smooth confidence of a veteran flight attendant. He genuinely wanted to help everyone find a solution that would work, but he was discovering that some conflicts couldn't be resolved with politeness and good intentions. His supervisor, David Thompson, watched from the galley with the careful neutrality of someone who had seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times before. At 35, David had been flying long enough to know that passenger disputes in first class were like small fires. They either burned out quickly or consumed everything around them. His instinct was to de-escalate, apologize to everyone involved, and hope the problem would resolve itself once the plane was airborne. Captain Maria Santos, 45 years old and one of the most experienced pilots in Apex Airlines' fleet, was completing her pre-flight checklist in the cockpit, unaware that the confrontation brewing in first class was about to fundamentally change the trajectory of her career and the aviation industry as a whole. She had spent 23 years flying commercial aircraft, and she prided herself on running a tight ship where passenger safety and comfort were paramount. Taylor Johnson, the social media influencer in Seat 3C, had started the day, hoping to document a routine cross-country flight for content about business travel luxury. Instead, Taylor was beginning to realize that the phone camera was capturing something much more significant. The livestream audience was growing rapidly as viewers shared the link, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would matter beyond the confines of this particular aircraft. But the most important person in this unfolding drama was someone who wasn't even on the plane. Luis Rivera, Alexis's younger brother and the chief operating officer of Rivera Aerospace Technologies, was sitting in a conference room in Irvine, California, reviewing quarterly projections when his phone would ring with a call that would activate protocols no one had ever expected to use. The Rivera siblings had built their company on the principle that technology should make flying safer for everyone, but they had also built in safeguards that gave them unprecedented authority over aircraft using their equipment. The Rivera Protocol was designed for catastrophic emergencies situations where the safety of passengers and crew required immediate intervention. It had never been used for a social confrontation, but the language in their contracts was broad enough to cover any situation that compromised the operational integrity of the aircraft. And operational integrity, Alexis was about to argue, included ensuring that passengers could travel without being harassed, intimidated, or assaulted by other passengers. Back in first class, the confrontation was escalating beyond polite disagreement into something that felt dangerous. Jennifer Walsh was not accustomed to being denied, and her frustration was building toward an explosion that would change everything. "I don't understand why this is so complicated," Jennifer said to Carlos, her voice rising to a level that was making other passengers uncomfortable. "Surely you can see that there's been some kind of error here. We need this resolved immediately." Alexis remained seated, watching the drama unfold with the calm attention of someone who had learned to recognize the precise moment when patience stopped being a virtue and started being a liability. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, could sense the collective discomfort in the cabin, could practically hear the assumptions being made about why she was the problem in this equation. But Alexis Rivera hadn't built a multi-billion-dollar company by backing down from uncomfortable situations. She had learned a long time ago that sometimes the only way to stop being treated as if you don't belong is to remind people that you actually own the building. The moment was coming when she would have to make a choice. She could continue to sit quietly, endure the confrontation, and hope that cooler heads would prevail. She could move to another seat, take the path of least resistance, and avoid making a scene. Or she could make a phone call that would ground a $200 million aircraft and change the airline industry forever. The standoff in first class was reaching a breaking point, and everyone in the cabin could feel it. Jennifer Walsh had positioned herself in the aisle like a general surveying a battlefield, her designer handbag clutched in front of her like a shield, her voice growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. "There's obviously been a mistake with the ticketing process," Jennifer declared, directing her words to Carlos, but speaking loudly enough for the entire first-class section to hear. "I've been flying this route for 15 years, and I know exactly what kind of passengers typically occupy these seats." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything around it. Alexis felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being reduced to a stereotype, being seen as a problem rather than a person being treated as if her presence in this space required explanation and justification. But she had learned long ago that the most powerful response to assumptions was facts. "My ticket is valid," Alexis said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had navigated far more challenging conversations in far more important rooms. "I purchased this seat 6 weeks ago. My confirmation number is in your operation. I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." Robert Walsh stepped forward, his bulk filling the narrow aisle space as he tried to use his physical presence to intimidate. He was the kind of man who had learned that most conflicts could be resolved by making other people uncomfortable enough to back down, and he applied this strategy with the subtle ruthlessness of someone who had never faced real consequences for his behavior. "Look, lady, let's just be realistic here," Robert said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "My wife and I paid full price for first-class seats on this route. We're Apex Airlines Diamond members. We fly this airline exclusively. Obviously, there's been some kind of upgrade situation or mistake with your booking." The assumptions were layered like sediment in his words. Obviously, a black woman in first class must be flying on an upgrade. Obviously, her ticket must be somehow illegitimate. Obviously, their status as frequent flyers gave them priority over her right to occupy the seat she had purchased. Carlos Martinez stood between the opposing forces like a referee in a boxing match where the rules kept changing. His training had covered difficult passengers, but nothing had prepared him for a situation where determining who was right required navigating the murky waters of racial assumptions and social prejudice. Sir Ma'am Carlos said, his voice carrying the strained politeness of someone who was beginning to realize that this confrontation was beyond his ability to resolve. "I've checked our records multiple times. This passenger's ticket is completely legitimate. She purchased a first-class seat and she's assigned to 1A. There's no error in our operation." David Thompson watched from the galley with growing concern. He had seen passenger disputes before, but there was something about the energy in this confrontation that felt different, more dangerous. The other first-class passengers were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats, some pulling out phones to record what was happening, others simply trying to disappear into their seats and avoid becoming part of the drama. Jennifer Walsh was not deterred by Carlos's explanation. In her world, problems existed to be solved and solutions existed to benefit people like her. She had never encountered a situation where her status, her wealth, and her sense of entitlement weren't sufficient to rearrange circumstances to her preference. "This is completely unacceptable," Jennifer announced, her voice reaching a register that made passengers throughout the cabin turn to look. "I want to speak to your supervisor immediately." And I want to see this woman's boarding pass and identification to verify that she actually belongs in this cabin." The request landed like a slap across Alexis's face. In a cabin full of passengers, she was the only one being asked to prove her right to be there. She was the only one whose ticket was being questioned, whose presence was being challenged, whose very existence in this space was being treated as suspicious. Taylor Johnson's live stream audience had grown to several hundred viewers, and the comments section was exploding with reactions from people who recognized exactly what they were witnessing. The hashtags were already starting to form organically: #Flight 847, #First Class Drama, #Apex Airlines. "Are you seriously asking me to prove my right to sit in a seat I purchased?" Alexis asked, her voice still calm but carrying an edge that made Carlos step back involuntarily. "I'm asking for verification that there hasn't been an error," Jennifer replied, her tone suggesting that this was a perfectly reasonable request. "Anyone can claim to have a ticket. I want to see documentation." Robert nodded in agreement, emboldened by his wife's aggressive stance. "Exactly. We just want to make sure everything is legitimate here. No harm in checking, right?" But there was harm in checking. There was harm in being the only person required to prove her worthiness. There was harm in being treated as guilty until proven innocent. There was harm in having her presence questioned while everyone else's was assumed to be legitimate. Alexis reached into her briefcase and pulled out her boarding pass, not because she believed she should have to, but because she wanted to remove any excuse for Jennifer's behavior. The boarding pass was printed on the heavy cardstock reserved for first-class passengers, complete with priority boarding designation and seat assignment clearly marked as 1A. "Here's my boarding pass," Alexis said, holding the document where Jennifer could see it. "Here's my driver's license. Here's my Apex Airlines Platinum Elite membership card. Are you satisfied, or would you like to see my passport as well?" Jennifer examined the documents with the intensity of a forensic investigator, clearly hoping to find some flaw, some irregularity, some excuse to continue her challenge. But the paperwork was perfect. The seat assignment was clear, and the membership status was undeniable. Faced with irrefutable evidence that Alexis belonged exactly where she was, Jennifer Walsh made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Instead of backing down, instead of apologizing, instead of accepting that she had been wrong, she decided to escalate. "Well, I still think there's been some kind of mistake," Jennifer said, her voice rising to a level that was making other passengers actively uncomfortable. "And I want this resolved before we take off. I'm not sitting next to someone who's going to be a problem for the entire flight." The accusation was clear. Despite having produced perfect documentation, despite being exactly where she belonged, despite having done nothing except exist in a space that Jennifer Walsh believed should be reserved for people who looked like her, Alexis was still being characterized as the problem. And that was the moment when Alexis Rivera decided that this confrontation had gone far enough. She had spent her entire life being polite, being patient, being understanding when people questioned her right to exist in spaces she had earned. But patience, she was beginning to realize, was just another word for accepting unacceptable treatment. She reached for her phone, and everything changed. What happened next would be replayed on news channels around the world, dissected in business schools for decades to come, and remembered as the moment when a routine passenger dispute became a turning point in the fight for dignity at 35,000 feet. Jennifer Walsh had reached the limits of her patience, and when Jennifer Walsh reached her limits, other people paid the price. "This is ridiculous," she announced to the cabin at large, her voice carrying the theatrical indignation of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. "I don't understand why we're wasting everyone's time protecting someone who clearly doesn't belong here." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a bottle of premium alkaline water, the kind that cost $12 at airport shops and came with claims about enhanced mineral content and improved hydration. Jennifer unscrewed the cap with deliberate precision, her movements telegraphing her intentions to everyone who was paying attention. "Jennifer, what are you doing?" Robert asked, sensing that his wife was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I'm solving a problem," Jennifer replied, her voice carrying the cold determination of someone who had decided that being polite was no longer serving her interests. Alexis watched Jennifer's movements with the careful attention of someone who had learned to recognize when situations were about to become dangerous. She could see the calculation in Jennifer's eyes, the decision being made in real time to escalate this confrontation beyond words and into the realm of physical action. Ma'am, Carlos said, stepping closer to Jennifer with growing alarm. "I need to ask you to please return to your seat so we can resolve this situation calmly." But Jennifer Walsh was beyond calm. She was operating in a space where her sense of entitlement had collided with reality and produced an explosive reaction that was about to endanger everyone on the aircraft. "Oops," Jennifer said, and then she deliberately tilted the water bottle, sending a cascade of expensive alkaline water directly onto seat 1A, soaking the plush leather upholstery and splashing onto Alexis's designer athleisure outfit. The water was cold against Alexis's leg, but the shock of the deliberately malicious act was what took her breath away. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was an assault, pure and simple, carried out in front of witnesses, with the assumption that there would be no consequences. Taylor Johnson's live stream audience exploded as viewers witnessed the attack in real time. The comments section became a torrent of outrage, disbelief, and demands for justice. #Jennifer Walsh was already trending, and the video was being shared across every social media platform. "Oh my goodness, look at that," Jennifer said with theatrical concern, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The seat is completely soaked. You obviously can't sit there now. How unfortunate." But Jennifer Walsh wasn't finished. Having crossed the line into physical confrontation, she decided to complete her hostile takeover of seat 1A. Before Alexis could react, before Carlos could intervene, before anyone could stop her, Jennifer grabbed Alexis's briefcase from the floor beside the seat and threw it into the aisle. The briefcase hit the floor with a sound that made every passenger in first class turn to look. Inside that briefcase were patents worth billions of dollars, contracts that could change the trajectory of nations, and technology that kept aircraft safely in the sky. But to Jennifer Walsh, it was just another obstacle to be moved out of her way. Jennifer then pushed past Alexis and slid into the wet seat, her designer clothing immediately absorbing the water she had just spilled, but her determination overriding any concern for her own comfort. There, Jennifer announced, buckling the seatbelt with a triumphant smile. "I'll just sit here out of the way. Robert, you can take my original seat." Problem solved. The cabin erupted in shocked murmurs. Passengers were openly recording now, their phones capturing every moment of what was clearly an unprecedented confrontation. David Thompson rushed forward from the galley, finally recognizing that this situation had spiraled completely beyond normal passenger service protocols. "Ma'am, you cannot forcibly take another passenger's seat," David said, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in commercial aviation. "I need you to return to your assigned seat immediately." "I'm not moving," Jennifer replied, her voice carrying the stubborn defiance of someone who had never been forced to face consequences for her actions. "This woman was obviously in the wrong place, and I've corrected the situation. Now can we please get this flight moving? We have important meetings in Los Angeles." Alexis Rivera stood in the aisle of the aircraft, her gray cashmere outfit darkened with water, her briefcase on the floor, her seat occupied by someone who had just committed what amounted to assault and theft in front of 40 witnesses. She looked at Jennifer Walsh, who was now pointedly staring out the window as if nothing had happened. She looked at Robert Walsh, who was avoiding eye contact with everyone in the cabin. She looked at Carlos Martinez, whose face was flushed with embarrassment and anger at his inability to control the situation. And then she made a decision that would change the aviation industry forever. "Ma'am," Alexis said, her voice cutting through the noise and confusion of the cabin like a laser through smoke. "You have just made the gravest error of your life." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a quality that made every conversation in the cabin stop. There was something in her tone, a note of absolute certainty, that made even Jennifer Walsh turn away from the window to look at her. Alexis didn't reach for the call button to summon more flight attendants. She didn't argue with Jennifer about who had the right to occupy the seat. She didn't make threats or demands or appeals to reason. Instead, she pulled out her phone and bypassed Apex Airlines customer service entirely. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed, the one labeled Luis. Emergency only. The phone rang once. Luis, Alexis said, her voice dropping to an Arctic temperature that made the air in the cabin seem to crystallize around her words. It's Alexis. We have a situation on Apex Flight 847 at JFK. I'm declaring this an unstable operational environment. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Luis Rivera's voice came through clearly enough for passengers in nearby seats to hear. Alexis, are you serious? Is there a mechanical problem? Are passengers in danger? Alexis looked directly at Jennifer Walsh, who was now staring at her with growing confusion and the first flicker of concern. The mechanical equipment are functioning perfectly, Luis Alexis said, her voice clear and carrying throughout the first-class cabin. But the human environment is compromised. A passenger has physically assaulted me, stolen my seat, and the crew has lost operational control of the cabin. Another pause, and then Luis's voice came through with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what was being requested. Are you activating Rivera Protocol? The entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. Even passengers who didn't understand the significance of those two words could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Alexis Rivera looked at Jennifer Walsh one more time, taking in the designer clothes. The entitled expression, the complete lack of understanding about what she had just set in motion. Rivera Protocol is active, Alexis said. Ground the aircraft. The silence that followed Alexis Rivera's words was the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes, tornadoes, and the collapse of empires. It was the silence of a world holding its breath before everything changed. Luis Rivera, Chief Operating Officer of Rivera Aerospace Technologies, was sitting in a sterile conference room in Irvine, California, reviewing quarterly profit projections when his sister's call shattered his afternoon and redefined his understanding of corporate power. At 38, Luis had helped build Rivera Aerospace from a two-person startup into a multi-billion-dollar technology empire. But he had never imagined that their most powerful contractual weapon would be used for a passenger dispute. Alexis, confirm your status, Luis said, his voice taking on the clipped professionalism of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds would either save lives or destroy careers. Are you reporting a technical malfunction? Is there an immediate threat to aircraft safety? The question was protocol, but the answer was about to redefine what aircraft safety meant in the modern world. The navigation equipment are functioning perfectly, Alexis replied, her voice clear and steady as Jennifer Walsh stared at her with growing alarm. The aircraft equipment are nominal, but the human operational environment has become hostile and unsafe. A passenger has physically assaulted me and seized my seat through force. The crew is unable to maintain order. I am declaring this an unstable operational environment under Section 12C of our service contract. Luis Rivera felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what his sister was requesting. The Rivera Protocol had been designed as a nuclear option, a fail-safe mechanism that gave Rivera Aerospace Technologies unprecedented authority over aircraft using their technology. It had been negotiated into their contracts as protection against catastrophic equipment failure, terrorist threats, or extreme weather events that could compromise aircraft safety. It had never been used for a social confrontation. Alexis Luis said carefully, Rivera Protocol requires immediate aircraft grounding and passenger evacuation. Are you certain this situation meets the threshold for activation? In the first-class cabin of Flight 847, every passenger was now openly staring at Alexis Rivera as the implications of her phone conversation began to sink in. Jennifer Walsh had stopped looking triumphant and started looking confused, while Robert Walsh had the expression of a man who was beginning to realize that his wife had just picked a fight with someone who could actually fight back. "Louis, I want you to think about this carefully," Alexis said, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused child. "Our contracts state that Rivera Aerospace guarantees the operational integrity of our avionics suite. That integrity includes the human factors that affect aircraft safety. A crew that is intimidated, overwhelmed, or unable to maintain passenger order cannot be trusted to handle an emergency situation." She paused, looking directly at Jennifer Walsh, who was now gripping the armrests of the seat she had stolen with white knuckles. "If these flight attendants can't stop one passenger from assaulting another and seizing their seat, how can they be trusted to evacuate this aircraft in an emergency? If the cabin environment is so hostile that passengers are attacking each other with impunity, how can we guarantee safe operations?" The logic was unassailable, and Luis Rivera knew it. Their sister had just found a way to use their most powerful contract provision to address a social injustice, and the legal implications were staggering. Rivera Protocol confirmed and activated. Luis said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone speaking for a multi-billion-dollar corporation. "I am initiating immediate aircraft grounding under emergency authority provisions. Stand by for confirmation from flight operations." In the conference room in California, Luis Rivera hung up the phone and immediately activated the emergency response protocol that had been gathering dust in their corporate procedures manual for 15 years. Within 30 seconds, his assistant was connecting him to the Apex Airlines Operations Center, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the executive leadership team of Rivera Aerospace Technologies. The first call went to Amanda Foster, Vice President of Operations for Apex Airlines, a woman who had spent 23 years in commercial aviation and thought she had seen every possible crisis that could affect aircraft operations. "Ms. Foster, this is Luis Rivera, COO of Rivera Aerospace Technologies." Luis said, his voice carrying the formal authority of someone delivering news that would change everything. "I am calling to inform you that we are immediately grounding Apex Airlines Flight 847 at JFK under the emergency provisions of our service contract. This aircraft is not authorized for departure under Rivera Protocol until further notice." Amanda Foster nearly dropped her phone. Rivera Protocol was a provision that existed in their contracts but had never been used, a theoretical nuclear option that gave Rivera Aerospace unprecedented authority over aircraft operations. The legal implications were staggering, the financial implications were catastrophic, and the public relations implications were beyond calculation. "Mr. Rivera, I need you to clarify the nature of the emergency," Amanda said, already pulling up the flight manifest and passenger information for Flight 847. "Are you reporting equipment malfunction? Is there a security threat?" "Ms. Foster, one of your passengers physically assaulted our CEO and seized her seat through force while your crew stood by unable to intervene," Luis replied, his voice carrying the steel of someone who held contracts worth billions of dollars. "We consider this a fundamental breakdown in operational safety that compromises the integrity of our avionics suite." The silence on Amanda Foster's end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds, and then she began making the calls that would ground a $200 million aircraft and trigger a chain reaction that would transform the airline industry. Back on Flight 847, Captain Maria Santos received the grounding order through official channels, her cockpit communication equipment lighting up with priority messages from Apex Airlines Operations, the Federal Aviation Administration, and Rivera Aerospace Technologies simultaneously. "Flight 847, this is Apex Operations," came the voice through her headset. "You are ordered to return to gate immediately. Do not repeat, do not attempt takeoff. Rivera Protocol has been activated. Emergency ground crews are standing by." Captain Santos had 23 years of flying experience, but she had never received a grounding order based on Rivera Protocol. She didn't even fully understand what Rivera Protocol meant, but the urgency in the communications was unmistakable. "Passengers, this is your captain speaking," Captain Santos announced over the aircraft intercom, her voice maintaining the calm professionalism that passengers expected even as her world was being turned upside down. "We are returning to the gate due to operational concerns. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We expect to be back at the gate momentarily." The first-class cabin erupted in confused murmurs as passengers tried to understand what was happening. Jennifer Walsh was still sitting in seat 1A, but her expression had changed from triumphant to concerned as she began to realize that the phone call she had witnessed might have consequences beyond her understanding. "What's Rivera Protocol?" she asked Robert, her voice carrying the first note of uncertainty she had displayed all morning. But Robert Walsh didn't know what Rivera Protocol was either. None of the passengers knew what Rivera Protocol was because it had never been used before. They were about to become part of aviation history witnesses to the first time a multi-billion-dollar corporation had used its technological leverage to ground an aircraft over a social injustice. Taylor Johnson's livestream audience had grown to over 10,000 viewers, and hashtag Flight 847 was trending on every social media platform as people around the world watched a routine passenger dispute transform into something unprecedented. The comments section was a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and growing awareness that they were witnessing a moment that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexis Rivera said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the first-class cabin as Flight 847 began its taxi back to the gate. "You have just witnessed the first activation of Rivera Protocol in commercial aviation history. This aircraft is being grounded not because of mechanical failure, but because the operational environment became unsafe due to passenger assault and crew inability to maintain order." She looked directly at Jennifer Walsh, who was now visibly trembling in the seat she had stolen. When people ask why this flight was grounded when this story appears on the news, when investigators review what happened here today, remember that it all started when someone decided that a black woman didn't belong in first class and was willing to use physical force to remove her. The weight of those words settled over the cabin like a blanket of consequences. Every passenger understood that they were no longer just travelers on a delayed flight. They were witnesses to a moment that would be studied, analyzed, and remembered for decades to come. And Jennifer Walsh was beginning to understand that her morning decision to make a stand about airplane seating was about to cost her everything she had ever cared about. As Flight 847 taxied back toward the gate, the first-class cabin became a pressure cooker of tension, confusion, and growing awareness that something extraordinary was happening. The passengers who had boarded expecting a routine cross-country flight were now unwilling participants in a moment that would reshape the aviation industry and redefine the boundaries of corporate power. Taylor Johnson's live stream had exploded beyond all expectations. What had started as casual travel content had become must-see television for millions of viewers worldwide. The audience had grown from hundreds to tens of thousands in a matter of minutes, and the comments section was a torrent of outrage, support, and disbelief. "This is unbelievable," Taylor whispered to the camera, careful to keep the phone positioned to capture the ongoing drama while remaining discreet enough to avoid becoming part of the confrontation. "I'm watching a billion-dollar CEO ground an entire aircraft because another passenger assaulted her and stole her seat. This is history happening in real time." The hashtags were multiplying across social media platforms. Hashtag Flight 847 Rivera Protocol, hashtag Apex, Airlines, and #Justice. 30,000 feet were all trending globally as people shared Taylor's live stream and began their own commentary on what they were witnessing. But inside the aircraft cabin, the human drama was intensifying as the reality of the situation began to sink in for everyone involved. Jennifer Walsh was no longer the confident, entitled passenger who had started the confrontation. The designer water bottle lay empty on the floor beside her stolen seat evidence of her assault on Alexis Rivera. Her Chanel blazer was stained with the water she had deliberately spilled, and her hands were shaking as she gripped the armrests of seat 1A. "Robert," she whispered to her husband, her voice carrying the first note of genuine fear she had displayed all morning. "What is Rivera Protocol? Why is everyone acting like this is such a big deal?" Robert Walsh was discovering that his decades of experience in commercial real estate had not prepared him for a situation where his wife's behavior could ground a commercial aircraft. He was a man who understood power leverage and consequences, and he was beginning to realize that they had just encountered someone who operated on a level far beyond their understanding. "I don't know what Rivera Protocol is," Robert admitted, his voice carrying the uncomfortable honesty of someone whose confidence had been shattered. "But if it can ground a plane, we're dealing with someone who has serious authority." Carlos Martinez stood in the aisle between the opposing forces, his young face flushed with a combination of embarrassment, anger, and growing admiration for the woman who had just done something he couldn't do. His training had taught him to de-escalate passenger conflicts through politeness and accommodation, but Alexis Rivera had just demonstrated a different approach entirely. "Ma'am," Carlos said to Alexis, his voice carrying a new note of respect that hadn't been there before. "I want to apologize. I should have been able to prevent this situation from escalating. I should have protected you." Alexis looked at the young flight attendant with compassion rather than anger. She understood that Carlos had been caught between impossible forces trained to please customers, even when customers were behaving inexcusably. "Carlos, this isn't your fault," Alexis replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You were following the procedures you were taught. But sometimes the procedures need to change, and sometimes it takes extraordinary circumstances to force that change." David Thompson approached from the galley, his 15 years of experience finally providing clarity about what he was witnessing. As the senior flight attendant on the aircraft, he understood that he was watching the birth of new protocols, new procedures, and new definitions of passenger safety. Dr. Rivera David said, using her title for the first time as recognition of who she actually was, began to spread throughout the cabin. "Is there anything we can do to assist you? Any support our crew can provide?" The use of her title sent ripples of awareness throughout the first-class cabin. Dr. Rivera. Not just a passenger who had been assaulted, not just a woman who had been discriminated against, but someone with credentials, authority, and apparently the power to ground commercial aircraft. Other passengers began pulling out their phones not to live stream or record, but to search for information about who Alexis Rivera actually was. What they discovered left them stunned. "Oh my God," whispered the passenger in seat 2C, staring at her phone screen. "Dr. Alexis Rivera. She's the CEO of Rivera Aerospace Technologies. They make the navigation equipment for most commercial aircraft. She's worth like $8 billion. The information spread through the cabin like wildfire. Passengers began sharing what they were finding online, piecing together the identity and credentials of the woman who had just used corporate leverage to ground their flight. Rivera Aerospace Technologies. The passenger in seat 3A read aloud from his phone. Founded 12 years ago, they hold patents on navigation equipment used in 70% of commercial aircraft worldwide. Annual revenue, $4.7 billion. CEO and founder, Dr. Alexis Rivera, MIT graduate aerospace engineer, listed as one of the most influential women in technology. Jennifer Walsh heard every word, and with each piece of information, her face grew more ashen. She was beginning to understand that she hadn't just picked a fight with another passenger. She had assaulted and attempted to intimidate one of the most powerful people in the aviation industry. "That's impossible," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. She doesn't look like..." But Jennifer couldn't finish the sentence because completing it would have required admitting exactly what she had assumed about Alexis Rivera based solely on her appearance, and those assumptions were now colliding with reality in the most spectacular and public way possible. Robert Walsh was frantically searching his own phone, pulling up news articles, corporate profiles, and financial reports that confirmed what other passengers were discovering. His wife hadn't just made a scene on an airplane. She had physically assaulted a billionaire CEO whose company had the power to ground aircraft, and she had done it in front of cameras that were broadcasting the entire incident to millions of viewers worldwide. Jennifer Robert said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man watching his life implode in real time. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any idea who this woman is?" But Jennifer Walsh was beyond understanding. She was trapped in Seat 1A, surrounded by evidence of her assault on one of the most powerful people in the aviation industry, while millions of people around the world watched her humiliation unfold in real time. Alexis Rivera stood in the aisle, her composure intact despite the water stains on her designer outfit and the briefcase that Jennifer Walsh had thrown on the floor. She was watching Jennifer's realization with the calm attention of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and was now demonstrating exactly why that was a mistake. Mrs. Walsh Alexis said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who owned the technology that kept commercial aircraft safely in the sky. "You asked me earlier if I knew who you were. You demanded to see my identification and questioned my right to occupy this seat. You physically assaulted me and stole my seat because you believed I didn't belong here." Jennifer Walsh tried to speak, but no sound came out. She was discovering that the voice that had been so confident and commanding just minutes earlier had abandoned her in her moment of greatest need. "But the question you should have asked," Alexis continued, "is whether you knew who I was. Because if you had taken 30 seconds to find out who you were confronting, you might have made different choices." The aircraft had come to a stop at the gate, and through the windows, passengers could see ground crews, emergency vehicles, and what appeared to be news cameras gathering on the tarmac. Flight 847 was no longer just a delayed departure. It was a news event, a corporate crisis, and a turning point in the fight for dignity in commercial aviation. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of Captain Santos over the intercom, "we have arrived back at the gate. Please remain seated while we resolve the operational concerns that required our return. Ground operations and corporate representatives will be boarding the aircraft shortly." Taylor Johnson's livestream audience had grown to over 50,000 viewers, and the story was being picked up by major news networks around the world. Rivera Protocol was trending globally, and social media was exploding with commentary about corporate power, racial discrimination, and the moment when consequences finally caught up with entitlement. "This is incredible," Taylor whispered to the camera. "Dr. Alexis Rivera just used her company's contracts to ground a commercial aircraft after another passenger assaulted her. I think we're watching the birth of a completely new way to fight discrimination. But for Jennifer Walsh sitting in the stolen seat that had cost her everything, the full scope of her mistake was just beginning to become clear. She was about to discover that some fights have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate confrontation, and some people have the power to ensure that those consequences are felt for years to come. The door of the aircraft opened, and Amanda Foster, Vice President of Operations for Apex Airlines, stepped aboard with a legal team, a security team, and a full understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether her company survived the crisis that Jennifer Walsh had just created. Amanda Foster had been in aviation crisis management for 23 years. But nothing had prepared her for what she encountered when she boarded Flight 847. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the live stream that was broadcasting the entire situation to millions of viewers worldwide had turned a passenger dispute into a global corporate crisis. She was accompanied by a team that included Apex Airlines' chief legal counsel, 2 security officers, and a crisis management specialist who was already fielding calls from major news networks. Behind them came representatives from Rivera Aerospace Technologies, including their general counsel and head of corporate security. "Ladies and gentlemen, Amanda Foster announced as she entered the first-class cabin, her voice carrying the authority of someone who held the future of a major corporation in her hands. I am Amanda Foster, Vice President of Operations for Apex Airlines. We are here to resolve the situation that led to the activation of Rivera Protocol. She looked around the cabin, taking in the scene, Alexis Rivera standing calmly in the aisle, her designer outfit still stained with water from Jennifer Walsh's assault. Jennifer Walsh herself trapped in seat 1A, looking like a deer caught in headlights. Robert Walsh frantically trying to avoid eye contact with everyone, and the other passengers, most of whom were recording everything on their phones. Dr. Rivera Amanda Foster said, approaching Alexis with the respectful deference due to someone whose contracts could make or break an airline. On behalf of Apex Airlines, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received on this aircraft. What happened here is completely unacceptable and contrary to every value our company claims to represent. The apology was public formal and being broadcast live to Taylor Johnson's audience of 50,000 viewers. It was also the first time anyone on the aircraft had used Alexis Rivera's proper title, and the sound of it seemed to crystallize the reality of what had transpired. Mrs. Foster Alexis replied, her voice maintaining the calm professionalism that had characterized her behavior throughout the entire confrontation. I appreciate your apology, but we need to address the broader issues that allowed this situation to develop. This wasn't just one passenger behaving badly. This was a complete breakdown of your crew's ability to maintain order and protect passengers from assault. Jennifer Walsh finally found her voice, though it came out as a whisper that barely carried beyond her immediate vicinity. I didn't know who you were, Jennifer said, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperation and panic. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. If I had known... But Alexis Rivera cut her off with a look that could have frozen helium. Mrs. Walsh, you're missing the point entirely, Alexis said, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone explaining basic concepts to a confused child. The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you thought who I was mattered. You assaulted me and stole my seat because you assumed I didn't belong here. If I had been a teacher or a nurse or anyone other than a billionaire CEO, would that have made your behavior acceptable? The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and everyone in the cabin understood that they were witnessing something more than the resolution of a passenger dispute. They were watching a lesson in power justice and the consequences of assumptions. Jennifer Walsh opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She was discovering that a lifetime of privilege had not prepared her for a moment when her assumptions about the world were being demolished in front of millions of witnesses. Dr. Rivera is absolutely correct, Amanda Foster said, stepping forward to take control of the situation before it could deteriorate further. Mrs. Walsh, I am immediately banning you from all Apex Airlines flights effective immediately and permanently. Your behavior today represents assault harassment and a fundamental violation of the safety and dignity of our passengers. The announcement sent shockwaves through the cabin. Permanent flight bans were rarely issued and never in such public circumstances. Jennifer Walsh was not only facing personal humiliation, but professional and social consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life. You can't do that, Robert Walsh said, stepping forward with the bluster of a man who was accustomed to solving problems with money and connections. Do you know who we are? We're Diamond members. We fly exclusively with Apex. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on airline tickets. But Amanda Foster had already made her calculations, and the math was simple. The Walsh family's annual spending was a rounding error compared to Rivera Aerospace Technologies' contracts with Apex Airlines contracts that were worth billions of dollars and could be terminated at will. Mr. Walsh, your wife physically assaulted one of our most important corporate partners and stole her seat in full view of witnesses and cameras. Amanda Foster replied, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had made a decision that could not be appealed. Your membership status is terminated along with hers. You are both banned from Apex Airlines permanently. Taylor Johnson's live stream audience was now approaching 100,000 viewers, and the comments section was exploding with reactions from people around the world who were watching entitled privilege meet consequences in real time. The story was being picked up by major news networks, and Rivera Protocol was trending on every social media platform. Furthermore, Amanda Foster continued, "We are implementing immediate changes to our crew training protocols. No Apex Airlines employee will ever again be placed in the position of having to choose between appeasing an aggressive passenger and protecting the dignity and safety of other passengers." Carlos Martinez stepped forward. His young face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and determination. Ms. Foster Carlos said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had learned an important lesson about courage and consequences. "I want to apologize to Dr. Rivera and to everyone who witnessed this situation. I was trained to de-escalate conflicts by accommodating aggressive passengers, but I should have recognized that Mrs. Walsh's behavior was assault, not customer service challenge." "Carlos, you're not responsible for this situation," Alexis Rivera said, her voice gentle but firm. "You were following the procedures you were taught. But this incident has demonstrated that those procedures need to change, and I'm confident that Apex Airlines will ensure they do change." David Thompson, the senior flight attendant, approached with the measured steps of someone who understood that his career was hanging in the balance. "Dr. Rivera, Ms. Foster." David said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years in commercial aviation and the understanding that he had failed in his most basic responsibility to protect passengers. "I take full responsibility for my failure to intervene when Mrs. Walsh became aggressive. I allowed protocol to override basic human decency, and I deeply regret that failure." Amanda Foster looked at David Thompson with the calculating gaze of someone determining whether he could be salvaged as an employee or needed to be removed as a liability. "David, you're suspended pending a full review of your handling of this incident," Amanda Foster announced. "Carlos, you're being promoted to senior flight attendant and will head our new passenger dignity training program." The reversal of fortune was swift and complete. Carlos Martinez, who had started the day as a nervous junior flight attendant, was now being handed responsibility for training an entire airline's crew in passenger protection protocols. David Thompson, who had relied on seniority and experience, was discovering that experience meant nothing when it wasn't applied with courage. But the most dramatic transformation was still to come. "Mrs. Walsh," Amanda Foster said, turning to address the woman who was still sitting in the stolen seat, "I need you to vacate Dr. Rivera's seat immediately and gather your belongings. Apex Airlines security will escort you from the aircraft and ensure that you do not attempt to board any other Apex Airlines flights." Jennifer Walsh finally began to move her hands, shaking as she unbuckled the seatbelt and struggled to stand. The designer outfit that had been her armor of privilege was now stained with the water she had used as a weapon, and her face was ashen with the understanding that her morning decision to make a stand about airplane seating had destroyed her life. "Dr. Rivera," Jennifer said, her voice barely audible as she gathered her designer handbag and prepared to face the cameras that were waiting outside the aircraft. I'm sorry. I truly didn't understand." But Alexis Rivera was no longer interested in Jennifer Walsh's apologies. "Mrs. Walsh, the only thing you need to understand is that your actions today have consequences," Alexis replied, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had just demonstrated the power to ground aircraft and end careers. "You physically assaulted me because you assumed I didn't belong in this seat. You were wrong about who I am. But more importantly, you were wrong about basic human dignity." As Jennifer Walsh was escorted from the aircraft by Apex Airlines security, her husband trailing behind her like a man walking to his own execution. The first-class cabin fell silent. The other passengers sat in stunned awareness that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when consequences had finally caught up with entitlement. Alexis Rivera calmly gathered her briefcase from the floor where Jennifer Walsh had thrown it checked her tablet to ensure it hadn't been damaged, and settled back into seat 1A. Her composure throughout the entire confrontation had been remarkable, and now, as the immediate crisis resolved, she appeared as calm as she had been when the confrontation began. "Ladies and gentlemen," Amanda Foster announced to the remaining passengers, "Flight 847 will continue to Los Angeles with a new crew and a renewed commitment to ensuring that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect. Dr. Rivera is there. Anything else Apex Airlines can do to address this situation?" Alexis Rivera looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of passengers who had witnessed her humiliation and her response to it. Many of them were still recording, still live streaming, still sharing her story with the world. "Ms. Foster, I want to be clear about something," Alexis said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin. "I didn't activate Rivera Protocol for revenge. I activated it to prove a point about passenger safety and human dignity. Your crew couldn't stop one passenger from assaulting another. If they can't maintain basic order during a seating dispute, how can they be trusted to handle an actual emergency?" The logic was unassailable, and Amanda Foster knew it. Rivera Protocol hadn't been misused. It had been used exactly as intended to address a fundamental breakdown in operational safety. "You're absolutely right, Dr. Rivera," Amanda Foster replied. "This incident will result in company-wide changes to our training, our procedures, and our culture. We will ensure that no passenger is ever again subjected to what you experienced today." As the aircraft was prepared for its continued journey to Los Angeles, Taylor Johnson's live stream audience had grown to over 200,000 viewers, and the story was being covered by every major news network in the world. #Rivera Protocol was trending globally, and Alexis Rivera had become an unwilling symbol of the fight against discrimination in commercial aviation. But for Alexis Rivera herself, the most important consequence of the morning's events wasn't the global attention, or the corporate policy changes, or even the personal satisfaction of seeing justice served. The most important consequence was the knowledge that she had finally found a way to ensure that the next person who looked like her would never have to endure what she had endured. Within 6 hours of Flight 847's return to the gate, the reverberations from the Rivera Protocol activation were being felt throughout the aviation industry corporate boardrooms across America and social media platforms around the world. What had started as a passenger dispute on a single aircraft had become a catalyst for industry-wide transformation. The emergency board meeting at Apex Airlines headquarters in Atlanta was unlike anything in the company's 40-year history. The boardroom, normally a place of measured discussion and careful deliberation, had been transformed into a crisis command center with lawyers, public relations specialists, operational managers, and executives all working to contain the damage from the morning's events. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," said Jonathan Miller, chairman of the board, his voice carrying the grave authority of someone who understood that the next few decisions could determine whether Apex Airlines survived as a company. "One of our passengers physically assaulted the CEO of our most important technology supplier, and when our crew failed to intervene, she grounded the entire aircraft. Using contractual authority, we didn't even realize she possessed Amanda Foster, who had flown directly from New York to Atlanta for the emergency meeting," nodded grimly. "That's correct, sir, Doctor. Alexis Rivera activated Rivera Protocol under Section 12C of our service contracts, which gives Rivera Aerospace Technologies the authority to ground any aircraft using their technology if they determine that operational safety has been compromised." The room fell silent as the board members digested the implications. Rivera Aerospace Technologies provided navigation and safety equipment for 83% of Apex Airlines' fleet. If they chose to terminate their contracts, it would effectively ground the airline permanently. "What are our legal options?" asked Sarah Chen, the company's general counsel. "Can we challenge the protocol activation? Argue that it was an abuse of contractual authority?" The legal team exchanged uncomfortable glances before the lead attorney responded. "Absolutely not," he said, shaking his head emphatically. Dr. Rivera's argument is legally bulletproof. She maintained that a crew unable to prevent passenger assault during a routine dispute couldn't be trusted to maintain safety during an actual emergency. From a liability standpoint, she was completely correct. Meanwhile, in Irvine, California, the Rivera Aerospace Technologies headquarters was experiencing its own crisis management situation, though their crisis involved managing success rather than containing failure. Luis Rivera stood before an emergency assembly of the company's senior leadership team, addressing executives who were still trying to process the fact that their CEO had just used their most powerful contractual weapon to fight discrimination on a commercial aircraft. "Let me be absolutely clear about our position," Luis announced to the room full of vice presidents, department heads, and legal advisors. Rivera Protocol was activated appropriately and will remain in effect until Apex Airlines demonstrates that they have implemented sufficient changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Luis said Maria Gonzalez, Vice President of Government Relations, the FAA, is requesting a full briefing on Rivera Protocol. They want to understand how a private company gained the authority to ground commercial aircraft. "The authority was negotiated into our contracts 12 years ago," Luis replied. "Every airline that uses our technology agreed to these terms because they wanted access to our guidance equipment. They can't claim surprise now that we're enforcing the contracts they signed, but the most significant changes were taking place in real time as Apex Airlines executives realized that their survival as a company depended on transforming their culture faster than anyone had thought possible." Effective immediately, Amanda Foster announced to a hastily assembled meeting of all Apex Airlines senior flight attendants and crew supervisors, "We are implementing the Rivera Standards for Passenger Dignity and Crew Authority." The term Rivera Standards had emerged spontaneously from the morning's events, but it was already becoming the new benchmark for passenger protection in commercial aviation. First, Amanda continued reading from notes that had been developed during the emergency board meeting. Any passenger who physically touches another passenger without consent will be immediately removed from the aircraft. No exceptions, no discussions, no attempts at mediation. Second, crew members are not only authorized but required to intervene when passengers engage in discriminatory behavior. Customer service does not include tolerating abuse. Third, any passenger who demands to see another passenger's documentation or questions their right to occupy their assigned seat will be considered to be engaging in harassment and will be subject to immediate removal. Carlos Martinez, who had been promoted from junior flight attendant to head of passenger dignity training in the span of 6 hours, stood before his new colleagues with the confidence of someone who had learned that doing the right thing was more important than following outdated procedures. "I want everyone to understand something," Carlos said, addressing the room full of flight attendants who were struggling to adapt to policies that had been unimaginable that morning. What happened on Flight 847 wasn't just about one passenger behaving badly. It was about all of us failing to protect someone who needed protection. He paused, thinking about the moment when he had stood helplessly in the aisle while Jennifer Walsh assaulted Alexis Rivera. "Dr. Rivera didn't ground that aircraft because she wanted revenge," Carlos continued. "She grounded it because she wanted to prove that passenger safety includes passenger dignity. If we can't protect people from harassment and assault, we can't protect them from anything." The transformation wasn't limited to crew procedures. Apex Airlines' legal department was working around the clock to implement changes that would prevent future incidents and demonstrate to Rivera Aerospace Technologies that the company was serious about reform. "We're implementing a new passenger Bill of Rights," explained Michael Torres, Apex Airlines' newly appointed Director of Passenger Experience, a position that had been created in direct response to the morning's events. "Every passenger has the right to travel without harassment, discrimination, or assault. Any violation of these rights will result in immediate intervention by crew members and, if necessary, law enforcement." The changes extended beyond policies to technology. Apex Airlines announced a partnership with Rivera Aerospace Technologies to develop new monitoring techniques that would use aircraft equipment to detect and record incidents of passenger misconduct, creating an permanent record that could be used for legal action and prevention. But the most significant change was cultural. The aviation industry had operated for decades on the principle that customer service meant accommodating passenger demands, even when those demands were unreasonable or harmful to other passengers. The Rivera Protocol activation had shattered that principle and replaced it with something new. The understanding that some passengers' comfort was not worth other passengers' dignity. The story was being covered by every major news network, and the footage from Taylor Johnson's live stream was being analyzed by legal experts, business analysts, and social justice advocates around the world. What we witnessed today represents a fundamental shift in corporate power dynamics, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, professor of business ethics at Harvard Business School during an interview on national television. Dr. Rivera used her company's technological leverage to enforce social justice in a way that traditional legal remedies could never have achieved. The brilliance of the Rivera Protocol activation, Dr. Williams continued, is that it created immediate, meaningful consequences for discriminatory behavior. Mrs. Walsh didn't just face social embarrassment or legal action that might take years to resolve. She faced instant, permanent consequences that fundamentally altered her life. Social media was exploding with commentary about the incident, but the most powerful responses were coming from people who had experienced similar discrimination and were celebrating the fact that someone had finally found a way to fight back effectively. Finally, wrote one Twitter user whose post was shared thousands of times. Someone with actual power used it to protect people like us instead of just talking about diversity and inclusion. Dr. Rivera didn't just ground a plane, wrote another. She grounded the entire operation of letting entitled people get away with treating others like garbage. The hashtag Rivera Standards was trending globally as people shared stories of discrimination they had experienced and expressed hope that the changes at Apex Airlines would spread throughout the industry. Jennifer Walsh, meanwhile, was discovering that her morning decision to steal an airplane seat had consequences that extended far beyond airline travel. By the end of the day, footage of her assault on Alexis Rivera had been viewed by over 10 million people, and her name had become synonymous with entitled privilege meeting its match. Her husband Robert's commercial real estate business was fielding calls from clients who were reconsidering their relationships with someone whose wife had become a global symbol of discrimination. The Walsh family's social circle, built around wealth and status, was rapidly distancing itself from the scandal. But the most profound change was happening within Apex Airlines itself, where employees at every level were beginning to understand that their company had been given a second chance to define what customer service meant in the modern world. "We have an opportunity here," Amanda Foster told the assembled executives during the emergency board meeting. "We can either see this as a crisis to be managed, or we can see it as a chance to become the airline that sets the standard for passenger dignity and respect." The choice, as it turned out, wasn't really a choice at all. Rivera Aerospace Technologies held too much leverage. Public opinion was too clearly on Dr. Puck. Rivera's side, and the moral imperative was too obvious to ignore. Apex Airlines was going to change whether they wanted to or not. The only question was whether they would embrace that change or be dragged through it. The transformation that followed the Rivera Protocol activation extended far beyond corporate policy changes and media coverage. In the days and weeks that followed Flight 847's grounding, the individuals involved in the incident discovered that their lives had been fundamentally altered by those crucial minutes in the first-class cabin. Alexis Rivera sat in her corner office overlooking the Pacific Ocean, 47 floors above the streets of downtown Los Angeles, reviewing the reports that had been flooding in from aviation companies around the world. In the 72 hours since the incident, she had received calls from CEOs of major airlines, government transportation officials, and advocacy organizations, all wanting to understand how the Rivera Protocol could be applied to their own operations. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 12 years, Rivera Aerospace Technologies had been quietly building the most sophisticated aircraft safety equipment in the world, and she had become known in industry circles as a brilliant but reclusive engineer who preferred technical challenges to public attention. Now, because of Jennifer Walsh's decision to steal her airplane seat, she had become one of the most recognizable faces in corporate America. Her phone rang, displaying the familiar number of her brother Luis. "How are you holding up?" Luis asked, his voice carrying the concern of someone who understood that their family's private company had just become the center of a global conversation about power justice and corporate responsibility. "I'm processing it," Alexis replied, looking out at the Pacific Ocean and thinking about the 12-year-old girl who had been told she didn't look like engineering material. "Do you know what the strangest part is? I've spent my entire career being invisible, being underestimated, flying under the radar. Now suddenly everyone knows who I am." "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Luis suggested. "Maybe it's time for people to see what you've built, what you've accomplished." Alexis considered this. She had built Rivera Aerospace Technologies partly as a response to a world that had consistently doubted her capabilities, and she had taken pride in succeeding quietly without fanfare or public recognition. But the events on Flight 847 had forced her into the spotlight, and she was beginning to understand that visibility came with both opportunities and responsibilities. "Luis, I've been thinking about something Alexis said," her voice carrying the thoughtful tone that her brother recognized as the precursor to major decisions. "What if we opened up the Rivera Protocol to other companies? What if we helped other corporations build similar safeguards into their contracts?" The suggestion was revolutionary. Rivera Protocol had been designed as a tool for their specific industry and their particular contracts, but the principle behind it using economic leverage to enforce social justice could potentially be applied across multiple industries and situations. "You're talking about fundamentally changing how corporate power is used," Luis replied, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who recognized a paradigm shift when he heard one. "You're talking about weaponizing business contracts for social good." "Exactly," Alexis said. "We've proven that economic consequences can be more effective than legal action for changing behavior. Why should that power be limited to aerospace technology?" Meanwhile, across the country, Carlos Martinez was experiencing his own transformation as he prepared for his new role as Apex Airlines Director of Passenger Dignity Training. The young man who had started the day as a nervous flight attendant was now responsible for retraining an entire airline's workforce in passenger protection protocols. The most important thing to understand, Carlos explained to a room full of senior flight attendants who were adjusting to their new authority and responsibilities, is that customer service doesn't mean enabling bad behavior. Our job is to ensure that every passenger can travel safely and with dignity. He clicked to the next slide in his presentation, which showed a photo of Flight 847's first-class cabin. When Mrs. Walsh demanded that Dr. Rivera prove her right to sit in her assigned seat, that wasn't a customer service issue. That was harassment. When Mrs. Walsh poured water on Dr. Rivera's seat, that wasn't an accident. That was assault. And when Mrs. Walsh seized Dr. Rivera's seat, that wasn't a seating dispute. That was theft. The room was silent as Carlos's words sank in. For decades, airline training had emphasized accommodation and de-escalation, often at the expense of passenger safety and dignity. The new protocols required a fundamental shift in thinking about what customer service actually meant. "Our new procedures are simple," Carlos continued. "If a passenger engages in discriminatory behavior, we intervene immediately. If a passenger physically touches another passenger without consent, we remove them from the aircraft. If a passenger questions another passenger's right to be in their assigned seat, we end the conversation." One of the senior flight attendants raised her hand. "Carlos, what if the aggressive passenger is a high-status frequent flyer? What if they threaten to take their business elsewhere?" Carlos smiled, thinking about Amanda Foster's response when Robert Walsh had made exactly that threat. "Then we let them take their business elsewhere," Carlos replied. Dr. Rivera's contracts with Apex Airlines are worth more than any individual passenger's annual spending. But more importantly, no passenger's comfort is worth another passenger's dignity. The transformation was equally dramatic for David Thompson, though in his case, the change involved recognizing the cost of inaction. His suspension from Apex Airlines had given him time to reflect on 15 years in commercial aviation and the moments when he had chosen protocol over principle. "I keep thinking about the look on Dr. Rivera's face when Mrs. Walsh threw her briefcase on the floor," David confided to his wife during dinner at their suburban home. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She was disappointed. Like she expected better from people and kept being proven wrong. "What are you going to do if they reinstate you?" his wife asked. "I'm going to be better," David replied. "I'm going to remember that my job is to protect passengers, not to avoid confronting people who are behaving badly." The ripple effects of the incident extended far beyond the aviation industry. Jennifer Walsh had become an unwilling case study in how quickly privilege could become liability in the age of social media and corporate accountability. The footage from Taylor Johnson's live stream had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, and Jennifer Walsh's name had become permanently associated with entitled behavior and discriminatory assumptions. Her husband Robert's commercial real estate business had lost several major clients, and their social circle had contracted dramatically as friends and associates distanced themselves from the controversy. But perhaps the most significant transformation was happening in corporate boardrooms across the country, as executives began to understand that the Rivera Protocol represented a new model for using business leverage to enforce social justice. What Dr. Rivera accomplished, explained Professor Margaret Chen during a lecture at Stanford Business School, was to demonstrate that economic power can be more effective than legal action for creating immediate accountability. Traditional civil rights enforcement relies on litigation, which can take years and often results in settlements that don't change behavior. The Rivera Protocol created immediate permanent consequences. Professor Chen clicked to a slide showing the stock price movements of various airlines in the days following the incident. Notice that Apex Airlines' stock price recovered within 48 hours of announcing their new passenger dignity policies, she continued. The market understood that the company had been forced to confront a liability they didn't even know they had, and investors viewed the forced changes as a competitive advantage. The academic analysis was being matched by practical application as other companies began to examine their own contracts and policies for opportunities to build similar protections. Taylor Johnson, whose live stream had brought the incident to global attention, had leveraged the viral moment into a career covering social justice issues and corporate accountability. The young influencer, who had started streaming for entertainment value, had become a recognized voice in conversations about power, privilege, and the role of technology in documenting and addressing discrimination. What made the Rivera Protocol so powerful, Taylor explained during an interview with a major news network, was that it created consequences that matched the impact of the discrimination. Mrs. Walsh didn't just embarrass Dr. Rivera. She created a hostile environment that compromised the safety and dignity of everyone on that aircraft. The protocol activation created consequences that were proportional to that harm. But for Alexis Rivera herself, the most important change was personal. The woman who had built her career by being underestimated was now dealing with the challenge of being fully seen, and she was discovering that visibility brought both power and responsibility. "I never wanted to be the face of anything," Alexis confided to her longtime assistant during a rare, quiet moment between interviews and meetings. "I wanted to build great technology and be left alone to do the work." "Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person for this," her assistant replied. "You're not doing this for attention or personal gain. You're doing it because someone needed to." As the weeks passed, it became clear that the Rivera Protocol activation had created something unprecedented, a template for using economic leverage to enforce social justice that could be applied across industries and situations. Companies began building similar provisions into their contracts, creating a new form of corporate accountability that operated independently of traditional legal options. The 12-year-old girl who had been told she didn't look like engineering material had grown up to build a multi-billion-dollar company and then used that company's power to ensure that other people wouldn't have to endure what she had endured. And in doing so, she had accidentally revolutionized the relationship between corporate power and social justice. 6 months after the Rivera Protocol activation that changed the aviation industry forever, the changes that had begun in the first-class cabin of Flight 847 had transformed not only the aviation industry, but the broader landscape of corporate accountability and passenger rights across multiple sectors. The term Rivera Standards had become synonymous with using economic leverage to enforce social justice, and companies across industries were implementing similar provisions in their contracts and policies. What had started as a response to airline discrimination had evolved into a comprehensive framework for corporate responsibility that was being studied and adopted worldwide. At Harvard Business School, Professor Patricia Williams was concluding her lecture on the Rivera case study to a packed auditorium of MBA students who had come to understand that they were studying a pivotal moment in the history of corporate power and social justice. The brilliance of Dr. Rivera's approach, Professor Williams explained to the attentive audience, was not just in using economic leverage to create accountability, but in demonstrating that corporate power could be wielded for social good without sacrificing business effectiveness. She clicked to a slide showing the stock performance of major airlines in the months following the incident. Notice that Apex Airlines' stock price not only recovered but actually outperformed the industry average after implementing the Rivera Standards, she continued. The market understood that the company had been forced to address liability risks they hadn't even recognized, and investors viewed the changes as a competitive advantage. A student in the front row raised her hand. Professor Williams wasn't Dr. Rivera's use of the Rivera Protocol technically outside the intended scope of the contract. Couldn't Apex Airlines have challenged it legally? Professor Williams smiled, recognizing the question that had been debated in legal circles for months. That's exactly the genius of Dr. Rivera's approach, she replied. She didn't stretch the language of the contract. She revealed the true scope of what operational safety actually means. A crew that can't maintain passenger dignity during a routine dispute can't be trusted to manage a real emergency. The academic analysis was being matched by practical implementation as companies across industries began incorporating similar accountability mechanisms into their operations. Carlos Martinez, who had been transformed from a nervous flight attendant into the director of passenger dignity training for Apex Airlines, was now traveling internationally to help other airlines implement their own versions of the Rivera Standards. The key understanding, Carlos explained to a room full of airline executives in Frankfurt, Germany, is that passenger safety includes passenger dignity. You cannot separate the two. When passengers feel unsafe due to harassment or discrimination, you have already compromised operational safety. His training program had become the gold standard for airline employee education, with other carriers licensing the curriculum and adapting it for their own operations. The young man who had stood helplessly in an aircraft aisle 6 months earlier was now recognized as one of the leading experts in passenger protection protocols. The Rivera Standards aren't just about preventing discrimination, Carlos continued. They're about empowering crew members to act decisively when passengers create hostile environments. We've eliminated the false choice between customer service and passenger protection. The changes extended far beyond crew training. Rivera Aerospace Technologies had partnered with technology companies to develop monitoring equipment that could detect and record incidents of passenger misconduct, automatically creating permanent documentation that could be used for legal action and prevention. Our new early warning equipment can identify hostile passenger interactions before they escalate to physical confrontation, explained Dr. Sarah Kim Rivera, Aerospace's Director of Human Factors Engineering, during a presentation at an international aviation safety conference. We're using voice pattern recognition, stress indicators, and behavioral analytics to give crew members advance warning when situations are becoming dangerous. The technology was being adopted not just by airlines, but by other transportation companies, hospitality businesses, and any industry where customer interactions could potentially become hostile. Meanwhile, the legal profession was grappling with the implications of using contract law to enforce civil rights in ways that traditional litigation couldn't match. The Rivera Protocol represents a fundamental shift in how we think about corporate accountability, explained Federal Appeals Court Judge Maria Santos during a legal symposium on civil rights and contract law. Dr. Rivera demonstrated that economic consequences can be more effective than legal remedies for changing behavior, and she created those consequences using existing contract provisions rather than relying on new legislation. The legal implications were still being debated, but the practical results were undeniable. Discrimination incidents in commercial aviation had decreased by over 60% industry-wide, and passenger satisfaction scores had reached historic highs as travelers felt safer and more respected. But perhaps the most significant long-term change was cultural. The aviation industry, which had operated for decades on the principle that customer service meant accommodating passenger demands, regardless of their impact on other passengers, had been forced to confront the reality that some customers' comfort was not worth other customers' dignity. "We've fundamentally redefined what customer service means," explained Amanda Foster, who had been promoted to Chief Passenger Experience Officer for Apex Airlines in recognition of her handling of the crisis. "Customer service now means ensuring that every passenger can travel safely and with dignity, not just accommodating the loudest or most demanding voices." The changes weren't limited to the aviation industry. Hotels, restaurants, retail businesses, and other service industries were implementing their own versions of the Rivera standards, creating comprehensive frameworks for protecting customers from discrimination and harassment. Taylor Johnson, whose live stream had brought the original incident to global attention, had leveraged that viral moment into a career documenting corporate accountability and social justice initiatives across multiple industries. "What makes the Rivera standards so powerful," Taylor explained during a TED Talk that was viewed by over 5 million people, "is that they create accountability in real time. Instead of waiting for legal action that might take years, companies can now create immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior." The broader social implications were equally significant. The Rivera Protocol had demonstrated that individual actions could create structural change when backed by sufficient leverage, and advocacy organizations were working to help other people build similar protections into their own professional and personal situations. Jennifer Walsh, meanwhile, had become a case study in how quickly privilege could become liability in the age of social media and corporate accountability. Her assault on Alexis Rivera had cost her family millions of dollars in lost business social standing and legal fees, while creating permanent consequences that would follow her for the rest of her life. But the most important long-term change was happening in airports, aircraft cabins, and transportation hubs around the world, where passengers who had previously faced discrimination now traveled with the knowledge that their dignity was protected by something more powerful than hope or good intentions. The Rivera standards had created a new reality where economic consequences backed up moral principles, where corporate power was aligned with social justice, and where the phrase customer service had been redefined to include the radical idea that every customer deserved to be treated with basic human respect. 6 months after Jennifer Walsh had demanded that Alexis Rivera move to the back where she belonged, the entire transportation industry had been restructured around the principle that everyone belonged exactly where they had earned the right to be. 1 year after the Rivera Protocol activation that changed the aviation industry forever, Alexis Rivera found herself boarding the same route that had made her a reluctant symbol of corporate accountability and social justice. Flight 847 from JFK to LAX had become something of a pilgrimage destination for civil rights advocates and business leaders. But for Alexis, it was simply the most convenient way to travel between her New York meetings and her California headquarters. The difference was immediately apparent as she approached the gate. The Apex Airlines staff recognized her instantly, not with the nervous deference of people trying to avoid another crisis, but with the genuine respect accorded to someone who had fundamentally improved their working conditions and professional dignity. Dr. Rivera said Miguel Torres, the gate agent who had processed her boarding exactly 1 year earlier, "It's an honor to welcome you aboard Flight 847 again. I wanted you to know that the changes you initiated have transformed our entire operation." Alexis smiled, remembering the young man's professionalism during the chaos of that morning 12 months ago. "Miguel, how has the Rivera Standards implementation affected your day-to-day work?" she asked, genuinely curious about the practical impact of the changes that had emerged from her confrontation with Jennifer Walsh. "Dr. Rivera, we handle passenger conflicts completely differently now," Miguel replied, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had been empowered to act decisively. "We intervene immediately when passengers engage in discriminatory behavior. We don't negotiate with harassment. And passengers respect us more because they know we have the authority to enforce standards." As Alexis boarded the aircraft, she was struck by the transformation in the cabin atmosphere. There was a sense of professionalism and mutual respect that hadn't existed a year earlier when crew members had felt powerless to intervene in passenger disputes and travelers had sensed that lack of authority. "Dr. Rivera, welcome back," said Carlos Martinez, who was now recognized as one of the leading experts in passenger protection protocols worldwide. His transformation from nervous flight attendant to confident authority figure was complete, and his presence in the cabin conveyed the message that passenger dignity was not negotiable. "Carlos, you look like a man who's found his calling," Alexis observed, noting the quiet confidence that had replaced the uncertainty she remembered from their first encounter. "You gave me the tools to do my job correctly," Carlos replied. "Before the Rivera Standards, I was trained to avoid confrontation at all costs. Now I'm trained to protect passengers at all costs. It makes all the difference." Alexis made her way to seat 1A, the same window seat that Jennifer Walsh had stolen with such dramatic consequences. As she settled in, she noticed a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, sitting with her family in first class, her dark skin and curious eyes reminding Alexis of herself at that age. The child was reading what appeared to be an aerospace engineering textbook, far above her grade level, but clearly within her comprehension. When she noticed Alexis settling into the seat beside her family, her eyes widened with recognition. "Mom," the girl whispered excitedly to the woman beside her. "That's Dr. Rivera. She's the lady who made it safe for people like us to fly." The comment hit Alexis with unexpected emotional force. She had spent her career being brilliant, being successful, being profitable, but she had never thought of herself as someone who made other people safe. The realization that this child saw her as a protector rather than just a business leader was profoundly moving. "What's your name?" "Alexis," asked the young girl, leaning across the aisle with genuine interest. "I'm Maya Thompson. My mom says you're the reason we can travel without people bothering us about whether we belong here." Alexis felt a catch in her throat as she realized that this child would grow up in a world where her right to occupy any space she had earned would be protected not just by hope or good intentions, but by economic reality and corporate policy. "Maya, what are you reading?" Alexis asked, gesturing to the engineering textbook. "It's about navigation equipment," Maya replied with the enthusiasm of a child discussing her favorite subject. "I want to understand how airplanes know where they're going. My teacher says I'm too young for this book, but I understand it anyway." The echo of her own childhood was unmistakable. Another young girl being told she was attempting something beyond her capabilities. another brilliant mind being encouraged to lower her expectations. Maya Alexis said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built a multi-billion-dollar company on principles that others had considered impossible. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're too young, too different, or too anything to pursue what interests you. If you can understand that book, then you belong in that conversation. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her business card. When you're ready for college, contact my company. We need engineers who understand navigation equipment and aren't afraid to read books that are supposedly too advanced for them. Maya's mother leaned forward, her eyes bright with tears. Dr. Rivera, you don't understand what this means to her, to us, she said. Maya has been told by teachers that she should focus on more realistic subjects. Having someone like you tell her to keep pursuing aerospace engineering, it changes everything. But Alexis understood exactly what it meant because she had been Maya once, reading books that were supposedly beyond her capabilities, pursuing interests that others considered unrealistic for someone who looked like her. The flight took off smoothly, with none of the drama or conflict that had characterized the same route a year earlier. As they reached cruising altitude, Alexis looked out the window at the landscape below and reflected on how much had changed. The Rivera Protocol had been activated exactly once, but its impact had transformed an entire industry. Airlines worldwide had implemented passenger protection standards that made discrimination both economically costly and operationally untenable. The phrase customer service had been redefined to include the radical concept that every customer deserved basic human respect. More importantly, people like Maya Thompson could now travel, learn, and pursue their ambitions without the constant threat of having their worthiness questioned by strangers who assumed they didn't belong. As the aircraft began its descent into Los Angeles, Alexis realized that the true measure of her success wasn't the billions of dollars her company was worth, or the patents that bore her name, or even the global recognition she had received for standing up to discrimination. The true measure of her success was sitting across the aisle reading an aerospace engineering textbook, a young girl who would never have to wonder whether she belonged in any space she had earned the right to occupy. Dr. Rivera, Maya said as the aircraft touched down at LAX, "Thank you for making it so people like us don't have to move to the back." Alexis smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought her from a 12-year-old being told she didn't look like engineering material to a woman whose refusal to give up her airplane seat had changed an entire industry. "Maya," she replied, "I didn't move from my seat so that people like you would never have to." As passengers deplaned, Alexis Rivera walked through the airport terminal with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had discovered that individual courage, when backed by sufficient leverage, could create change that extended far beyond the original moment of conflict. She had refused to be moved, and in doing so, she had moved the world. The young girl, who had once been told she didn't belong in advanced placement, had built a company that ensured no one else would ever have to prove their right to occupy the spaces they had earned. And somewhere in America, in classrooms and boardrooms and airplane cabins, other young girls were reading books that were supposedly too advanced for them, pursuing dreams that others considered unrealistic, and traveling without fear because someone had finally made it clear that dignity wasn't a luxury service. It was a basic human right backed by economic reality and protected by corporate policy. The fight for respect had been won not through legislation or litigation, but through the simple act of refusing to accept unacceptable treatment and having the power to make that refusal matter. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to remember that one person with courage can change entire industries. What do you think? Was the Rivera Protocol the most epic response to discrimination in modern history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I read every single one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories of justice and dignity like this one. And if you know someone who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere, they've earned the right to share this video with them. Thanks for watching, and remember, never let anyone tell you where you belong. You belong exactly where you've earned the right to be. Until next time, keep standing your ground with grace and never underestimate the power of refusing to be moved when you're standing in the right place. See you in the next one.